So, hi everybody, and forgive my weird hair. I've been trying to cut it myself during the pandemic and it's not working out. Today, I want to focus on the changes in representations of women and in attitudes toward women during the medieval period, and how to define that era um, temporally is a bit of a challenge, and historians disagree, but usually we think of the period from when the Roman Empire falls around 476, depending on which war you pick, and then all the way up to the rise and creation of the printing press, which gave far more people access to books. So again, the way you define the Middle Ages varies a little bit on, according to what you focus on. But I'm talking about this period when the courts in Europe were flourishing, and there was a new interest in the arts, and the men were off fighting the Crusades, many of them, and so all of a sudden the women were left in charge. So I want to step back for a minute in time and just remind you of what I was trying to show in the PowerPoint presentation, which is that a lot of the early creation stories, whether they came from, say, the Phoenicians, or whether they originated in the Mesopotamian basin, or in Greece or Rome, uh, they often had gods and goddesses, as you know, very strong male and female figures. But over time, it seemed that it was often the negative activity of the female that was emphasized. So, uh, if you take Tunisia, for example, in North Africa, we have Tanit, who oddly was a goddess of war, but she was also the goddess of uh, all things maternal, of new life, of regeneration. She was treasured by those working in medicine, the nurses of ancient times. She was associated with fertility, so kind of a balance of things negative and positive. But little by little, it was sort of the warlike aspect that came to be emphasized sometimes. Um, if you look at the story of Pandora, which is really interesting, according to folk who read Greek, which I don't, I've studied it, but I didn't get far enough. The story of Pandora and the way in which it's interpreted is actually based on a linguistic misinterpretation of one of the most important words in the story, which is that when she opened the box, she unleashed something. And we often use words that are close to to evil or all ills, that there was this perfect world until Pandora messed it up. And like I say, it's not quite an accurate reading of the language of the story, and yet it was the interpretation that came to dominate. Why? There are different theories. Why did things turn so misogynistic in so many different parts of the world around the same time? So there are great books on the topic. The Rise of Patriarchy is one, or The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner is an excellent source if you're interested in that. And I can give you that link later. But anyway, if you look at the Bible, people who are scholars and who know far more about this and who can read it in the original language, and we will have one article on this topic later, but they have told me there are actually different creation stories. If you look very carefully, three slightly different stories on the same topic of how men and women came to be. And if you really read the text in the original language, there's an older version that has very gender neutral language, which is that God created he, them, male and female created he, them. And there's this idea of simultaneity, of God creating these two beings that complement each other simultaneously. And there's another version that's like that. But then we get a version from the 6th century BC, and these things are dated according to the language that is used and what we know about language in that era. But anyway, this is a story that's followed by the account of Eve and the tree of knowledge and so on. And so what's interesting there is it's not the story that emphasizes simultaneity, but this idea that Eve was created after Adam from his rib, and that Eve then tempted him with the apple, which gets emphasized. And that's understandable. It's a longer story, and it is an account of how evil comes into the world, so you can understand the emphasis on it. But the conclusions drawn are very negative for women, because what's decided is that women are secondary, they're derivative, and hence they're inferior. It's not the idea of practice makes perfect, and what comes second is maybe better. That's never a part of the conversation. Because she is second, she is farther from the mind of God. Adam comes directly from God, would say the theologians. He is more connected to the mind of God, whereas Eve comes from the physical body of Adam. And so it leads to things like, women not being able to preach because they're not as close to God and that sort of thing. In the very early church, we know that a lot of the women were the ones who were organizing the get-togethers. And Paul writes to Priscilla, treating her as an equal, someone also concerned with the church. But these are not the parts of the Bible that are getting emphasized. So what you see is a period leading into the Middle Ages when women are seen very negatively. They're secondary, they're derivative, they're less perfect. They're not as rational and spiritual, hence they're more emotional, more prone to tears, said one of the quotes that we saw. They're blamed for all kinds of things. If a child has a birth defect, it's because of the mother. She looked at something and it affected her. She wasn't strong enough to take it. Just all kinds of variations on that same theme. And that affects how women are seen and the things they're allowed to do in society. It has a very pervasive effect. Well, the Middle Ages brings a bit of a sea change because a lot of things happen. You have the rise of the guilds, more people working, and then you have the Crusades, and you also have the way property is arranged, the way people live is different. So the Crusades occur, a lot of men leave, and what does that mean? The women now have to manage entirely these huge properties, these domains where people live. They're sort of like self-sustaining communities in a way. They're big properties where you grow your own food and you make your own clothes. And on that property, you would have workers who were weavers and farmers and blacksmiths and all kinds of people sort of living together. And you would also have towns, but it was a little different from the Roman setup. So from the setup during the Roman Empire. So the men leave, and all of a sudden the women are doing all kinds of things. It's a little bit like World War II. We were discussing this during the Zoom when all the men left to fight in World War II, and the women had to fill their shoes and step into the workforce. 2 million women step into the workforce. No, I think it's 8 million women is the figure for the US. So anyway, all of a sudden women are in charge. And I think it was very empowering for them. And they began having what we call salons or salons. And salon in French, as I indicated, means a living room. That's all it means, a living room. And the idea was you would invite people from other domains to come to your living room for an afternoon or an evening. And it was how, in the days before journalism or radio, it was how news was shared. What have you heard? Has your spouse come back from the Crusades? There were multiple Crusades, and different men were on different ones. So, if you were on the first crusade, you might have news that the wife of someone whose husband was on the fourth crusade hadn't heard. You see what I mean? So they would see people who were traveling to or from and pass word back and forth. So the women would gather at these salons, and they would bring their ladies in waiting who were often of lower social status, right? And, a whole crew of them. And some of these might be also women who came from very humble origins. And this is significant because by attending the salons, these women were all given access to a form of education. Because what would they do? They would talk about politics. They would talk about, how to manage a domain, things maybe having to do with agriculture or economics, a lot about, the Crusades. But then there was also entertainment, the reading of poetry. So, who were the entertainers? And this is important. The entertainers for the salons were troubadours, trovarits, we call them, because a lot of this is happening in southern France. And so there's a language particular to southern France at the time. So you might hear troubadour, you might hear trovarits, or wandering minstrel, performer, whatever. But anyway, these were multi-talented individuals, and there was some variance, but some of them were women. There were 23 women that we know about who were composers and poets and performers. They were singer-songwriters, and they would compose texts, or they would find poetry and they would set it to music, and then they would perform it. And there were, lyres and harps and something that's a little bit like a guitar or a viola, ancestors of our current instruments. And what's really interesting is that if you look at the literature they were performing, it's in the courtly love tradition. This is what became very popular. They were songs of praise to women and to love. Now, before this period, love was kind of seen as a malady, right? You were struck by Cupid's arrow. Oh no, love is a wound. It hurts. And the early Christian authors who thought that God's return was imminent, they were concerned with people remaining pure, focused on things spiritual, and you can understand that. And so they were kind of against, physical relations. They preferred celibacy that would encourage remaining focused on the spiritual, not on the terrene, not on things of the earth. So anyway, love and all that was sort of frowned upon a bit, and in the literature, in the philosophy. But you start getting into the Middle Ages, and there's sort of like a love explosion. And one of the reasons is that in the Arab world, in North Africa, there were Arab poets whose works were really flourishing. And they had a tradition of honoring women, of putting women on a pedestal. It was their poetic tradition. And these poets, if you think about history, they came from, say, Saudi Arabia, and they crossed the North African continent, and then they went up through the Straits of Gibraltar, where there are only 17 miles between Morocco and Spain. And they would cross that body of water because they conquered Spain, right? They had their courts there. And so the Arab poets were flourishing in Europe, in Spain, and also in parts of France. And so their poetry is what a lot of these minstrels were using to come perform for these women at the domains, in the salons, because these were poems that honored women. And so there's the sharing of poetry, the sharing of politics, of news, of information about how to run a domain. It was really a very educational experience, and I imagine quite a fun one. So anyway, what changes attitudes toward women? I would say the Crusades, the rise of the salons, the fact that women are engaged in all kinds of activities that, as I said, are very empowering. Women discovered they had new skills and abilities. And let's see. And then I'm trying to keep an eye on my notes here. Um, but there was one more thing, and that was the cult of Mary. So this is not cult in any kind of negative sense, but in Byzantium, also called Constantinople, but uh, this was one of the destinations of the Crusaders, one of the places where they fetched up. And they discovered there that the church, because there was a Christian church flourishing there, and they had opted for focusing not on the person of Eve, this evil doer, but on Mary, the source of human redemption and new life, the new Eve, if you will. And so there was a very strong, what we refer to as cult of Mary. And the Crusaders encountered that. And I think they were very in awe of these beautiful churches with beautiful sculptures of Mary, with all these mosaics showing Mary with the Christ child in her arms, beautiful art. And they were moved by it. And they brought that back with them to Europe. And you see that beginning to soften attitudes in the church. You see the church itself begin to emphasize Mary more than Eve. And then I guess the last thing I would emphasize is that we begin to have, when the men leave, there are women in the church, women who were raised in the church, because convents had always been very important as places where an orphan child could be tended. Or if there was a very wealthy family who wanted an educated daughter because there were no school systems that were open to girls, they would offer land to the church or some gift to the church in exchange for the church educating their daughter. So through the church, there came to be some very educated, very admirable women. And they began accruing their power in different ways, out of a desire often to build their abbey into something even better. So we have these abbesses, these women of the church in charge of, convents, orphanages, whatever, who are building up their power, to help people. And they're accruing land and accruing prestige, and they're writing, there are beautiful writings by people like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich. Maybe you've heard these names, but there are many of them. And they're saying things like Hildegard of Bingen has this beautiful quote that, the love is not a bad thing at all. The love of man for a woman is the first taste of Christ's love for the earth, that or for humans, that moment when you stop focusing on yourself because you love somebody more than yourself, that is a very liberating, very holy, spiritual moment. And so we have a different attitude toward women and a different attitude toward love that's emerging. And so that's why you have a story like L'Envol getting written. It comes from the courtly love tradition, which is the idea of, we say courtly because it was born in the courts. That's where you have people who know how to read and write, so they're the ones sort of encouraging this literature. People like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who may have been the mother of Marie de France, or she at least was a patron. Maybe I should say matron, but sometimes matronly sounds kind of dowdy and, less prestigious than to be a patron of the arts. But I'd say she was a great matron of the arts. Anyway, Eleanor of Aquitaine fostered Marie de France, we think, because a lot of manuscripts by Marie de France are in the courts that Eleanor of Aquitaine frequented in France and England. So what I wanted to say is the courtly love originates in the courts, and but then spreads throughout Europe, all of Europe. And it has this tradition, you put woman on a pedestal, and the man has to prove himself worthy of the woman. He has to engage in acts of ever-increasing courage and difficulty, slay the dragons and all that stuff. Now, courtly love can be a double-edged sword for a woman, because it puts her on a pedestal, but some say it freezes her there. She can't move. She can look down from her tower on the world below, but she doesn't get to be the one riding the horses, and fooling around in the tournaments. She has to just sit there and be the object of male adoration. She doesn't get to have much agency. She doesn't get to do stuff. So some people say, yeah, it's a big improvement, but it is a double-edged sword. So anyway, I leave you with all this. I don't like to watch videos that are too long. I hope that wasn't too long. Oh, it was way too long. I won't do that to you again, I promise. Bye.